My son told me it was just old age when I was sick and struggling to breathe. He didn't know his family's entire safety net was a secret I kept paid for by me. So I made one quiet phone call. They thought I was weak. They were about to learn their health was a privilege I could revoke. My true story from Michigan. When I was sick and struggling to breathe, my son Michael told me it was just old age. His wife Tanya told me they were too busy to help. So I made one quiet phone call and canceled the family health insurance policy I had secretly paid for a decade. They were about to learn that their health was a privilege I could revoke. This story begins not with a single act of cruelty, but with the slow, creeping chill of being erased. It started in a house in Ann Arbor that was not mine, but was held together by my hands and my history. The walls were filled with the echoes of my silent labor, and the air had grown thin with the disrespect they breathed out as easily as oxygen. They saw me not as a mother, not as Evelyn, but as a utility, a dishwasher, a cook, a babysitter that had started to malfunction. And when a utility breaks, you don't fix it. You ignore it until you can replace it. They thought my silence was the sound of surrender, the quiet hum of an old appliance winding down. It was a mistake. My silence was a courtroom where I was the only juror, and the evidence was piling up every day. The final verdict came that winter when I lay gasping for air and my own son wouldn't look up from his phone. In that moment of crystal clear neglect, I understood. It was not my home I needed to take back. It was the safety net, the invisible shield I had held over their lives for 10 long years. So I did. I quietly, calmly, and procedurally canceled the health insurance policy that had shielded their entire family from the harsh realities of life. It was not an act of revenge. Revenge is loud and messy. This was a lesson in consequence, a final, perfectly balanced entry in a ledger of wrongs. It was delivered with the same quiet indifference they had so masterfully shown me. They believed I was just a ghost in their hallways, a piece of old furniture that smelled of mothballs and regret, taking up space they could use for something new and shiny. They would soon learn that the ghost they chose to ignore was the one paying for their protection against the very real specters of sickness, accidents, and debt. This is not a story about what they did to me. It is a story about the moment I remembered who I was and what my name, Evelyn Reed, in bold ink on a legal document truly meant. Paper doesn't forget even when people do. It's the story of how a woman made invisible by the very people she gave life to chose to reclaim her presence, not by shouting, but by simply removing her protection. I let them face the cold, hard world they thought they had mastered all on their own. The foundation of their comfortable lives was me, and I had decided to walk away. The whole house was about to fall. The air in that home had grown thin, and I had simply finally stopped holding my breath for them. When my husband Robert passed, the world went quiet. The silence in our small home was a physical weight, a constant deafening reminder of a life that was now over. It was in that crushing stillness that my only son, Michael, made his suggestion. "It doesn't make sense for you to be alone, Mom." He'd said, his voice laced with an earnestness I mistook for genuine concern. And so, I began the process of dismantling my life. I sold the house that held 60 years of my memories, the one Robert and I had built from the ground up with our own hands. I saw it as an investment in the future, not an erasure of the past. The first entry in my new ledger was a silent one. I took a significant portion of the money from the sale and paid off the last of Michael's student loans. The burden he'd carried for a decade vanished with a single bank transfer. I put the rest into a savings account, a quiet emergency fund for the family I was about to join. I arrived at their sprawling suburban house in Ann Arbor with 2 suitcases and a heart full of hope. I truly believed I was becoming part of a family again. I didn't realize I was merely changing my job title from wife to unpaid domestic. My days quickly fell into a rhythm dictated not by my own needs, but by theirs. I was the first one up my arthritic hands preparing breakfast long before the sun streaked the sky. I cooked their meals, the familiar, comforting scents of pot roast and apple pie filling a house where I was treated like a polite stranger. I cared for their son, my grandson Caleb, my heart aching with a love that felt one-sided. I ferried him to and from school, sat with him through his homework, and listened to his bright, innocent childhood dreams. Tanya, my daughter-in-law, appreciated my efforts the way one appreciates a well-functioning appliance. In front of her friends, she would praise my cooking, my reliability. "She's a lifesaver," she'd say with a practiced smile. But when she thought I couldn't hear, I'd catch her whispers to Michael in the kitchen, complaining about the rising cost of groceries since I'd arrived. Slowly, she began erasing my presence. A framed photograph of Robert and me on our wedding day, which I'd placed on the mantel, was replaced by a minimalist glass vase. My favorite armchair, worn soft from years of use, disappeared one afternoon, its place taken by a cold leather chair that matched her modern aesthetic. I became a tolerated ghost in their home, a silent shadow that did the laundry and folded the towels just so. My most significant contribution, however, was a secret I kept locked in my heart. Shortly after I moved in, I was tidying the mountain of mail on the kitchen counter when a particular envelope caught my eye. It was stamped in red, "Final Notice." It was from their health insurance provider. My blood ran cold. With a young son and Michael's stressful job, I knew they couldn't afford to be without coverage. A single medical emergency could bring them to financial ruin. That evening, I didn't say a word. I simply took the bill to my room. The next morning, while they were all busy with their day, I made a quiet phone call. Using my own savings, the money from the home Robert and I had built, I paid the entire overdue balance. Then I did something more. I transferred the policy into my name, making myself the primary account holder. From that day forward, it became my private ritual. Every month I would sit at the small desk in my room and quietly pay the premium that shielded all of them, Michael, Tanya, and Caleb. It was my secret gift, a mother's protection. I never told them. I didn't want their gratitude, which would have felt as hollow as Tanya's compliments. I wanted their love. I thought my silent sacrifice would be felt, that by absorbing their burdens, I was weaving myself into the very fabric of their lives, making myself indispensable. I was the foundation they stood upon, solid and unnoticed. I never imagined they would one day look down and see that foundation as nothing more than dirt beneath their feet. There are 2 kinds of cold that can settle deep inside a person. The first is the kind that bites at your bones, the brutal Michigan winter that reminds you with every gust of wind that you are mortal. The second is the kind that freezes the heart a coldness that comes not from the weather, but from the people you call family. That winter, I learned to tell the difference. It began with the flu. It arrived quietly, a simple tickle in my throat that I dismissed with a cup of tea. But by nightfall, it had descended into my chest, a heavy, solid weight that felt like a block of ice. The fever came next, a dry fire that left me shivering uncontrollably under a mountain of 3 blankets. My joints, which had served me faithfully for 67 years, began to scream with a sharp, forgotten pain. Every breath became a chore, a ragged, wheezing sound that echoed in the lonely silence of my small bedroom. For 2 days, I fought it alone. I would shuffle to the kitchen for a glass of water, my body a leaden weight each step and monumental effort. I would force down a piece of dry toast, willing my body to find some strength. But on the morning of the 3rd day, I knew I had lost the battle. The simple act of sitting up sent the room spinning into a nauseating blur. I was weak, dizzy, and the rattling in my chest had become a desperate struggle for air. I needed help. I found Michael in the living room, his face bathed in the cold blue light of his phone screen. Tanya was perched at the kitchen island, her finger tracing a path down the glossy page of a home decor catalog. The picture of domestic peace was a bitter irony. "Michael," I whispered. My voice was a thin, hoarse thread of sound. "I think I need to see a doctor. I can't breathe properly." He didn't look up from his screen. His thumb continued its mindless, rhythmic swipe. "It's just the flu, Mom," he said, his voice flat with indifference. "You just need to rest. Drink some fluids." Tanya glanced over her shoulder, and her expression was not one of concern, but of pure, undisguised annoyance. My illness? My struggle for breath was a personal inconvenience to her. "Evelyn, you're not a child," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "It's just old age catching up to you. Take some aspirin and go back to bed. We're too busy to run to the emergency room for a simple cold. Too busy." The words struck me with more force than the fever. They echoed in the space where my breath should have been. It wasn't about a lack of time. It was a lack of care so absolute, so profound, that it was breathtaking. I looked at my son, my only child, pleading with my eyes for him to see me, to see my distress, to see the mother who had rocked him to sleep and nursed his own fevers. He just grunted a small sound of agreement with his wife and turned his attention back to the glowing screen in his hand. In that moment, something inside me shifted, a quiet, tectonic crack in the foundation of my life. The physical pain from the sickness was suddenly eclipsed by a different kind of ache, a cold, hollow clarity. These people, my family, would watch me suffer. They would step over my body on their way to work, annoyed at the obstacle. The years of my silent service, the meals cooked, the home kept the savings I had used to secure this very roof over their heads. It all meant nothing. I wasn't their mother. I wasn't family. I was a fixture, a convenience. And a broken fixture is simply ignored until it can be thrown away. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or plead again. I simply turned. My hand found the wall, steadying myself against the sudden, icy calm that was spreading through me. Each rattling breath I took on the slow journey back to my room felt different. It was no longer the sound of sickness. It was the rhythmic, steady sound of a resolve hardening like steel within me. They had mistaken my love for an obligation. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. They had left me to fend for myself when I was at my most vulnerable. A strange certainty washed over me, chilling the fever from my skin. They would soon learn what it truly meant to be on their own. There is an unspoken ledger between a mother and the family she raises. For years I had made deposits of love, care, and sacrifice, believing it was an investment in our shared future. I learned in the shivering aftermath of a single night that they saw it only as a utility, a service to be consumed until it ran out. The next morning, the fever had broken, but the chill inside me remained. It wasn't the lingering ghost of illness. It was a clear, diamond-hard resolve that had settled deep in my bones. I felt no rage, no burning desire for revenge. What I felt was the profound sense of balance a bookkeeper feels when a long unsettled account is about to be reconciled. I moved with a deliberate slowness, the aches in my body, a stark reminder of what my son had been willing to watch happen. I showered the hot water of foreign comfort against my cold skin and dressed in simple, practical clothes. In the kitchen, sunlight sliced across the floor, illuminating the casual wreckage Michael and Tanya had left behind. Dirty plates, smeared with the remnants of their hurried breakfast, were stacked precariously in the sink. A half-empty carton of milk was left on the counter. It was a familiar scene, a daily testament to their thoughtlessness. I turned on the tap and washed them just as I did every day. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, the scent of the dish soap and the warmth of the water, a grounding ritual. This was a final act of the person I used to be, the woman who cleaned up their messes without question. Each clean plate I placed in the drying rack was a silent farewell. Then I went to my room and closed the door. The space felt different, entirely my own, for the first time in years. From the bottom drawer of my dresser, tucked beneath a stack of old letters bound in faded blue ribbon, I retrieved the file. The letters were from Robert, my late husband. His familiar script, a testament to a time when my love was returned in equal measure. I set them aside gently and held the simple manila folder. It was neatly labeled with a single word, insurance. Inside were years of receipts, policy documents, and confirmation letters, a paper trail of my devotion. My name, Evelyn Reed, was printed at the top of every page as policyholder. It was a title I had never truly considered. I held the policy. I paid the premiums. I was the source. Their names, Michael, Tanya, Caleb, were listed below under the sterile heading, Dependents. The word hung in the air, suddenly imbued with a terrible weight. They were dependent not on the policy, but on my willingness to provide it. I sat on the edge of my bed and picked up the phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I dialed the number on the top of the latest statement, the one for the customer service line of the insurance company. The cheerful, automated voice greeted me, a disembodied sound from a world of simple transactions. I navigated the menu with procedural precision. To make a payment, press 1. For questions about your coverage, press 2. To cancel a policy, press 5. I pressed 5. A moment later, a polite young woman answered. "Thank you for calling. My name is Jessica. How can I help you today?" Her voice was warm, professional. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were a lawyer acting on behalf of a long-suffering client. "Hello, Jessica." I said, my own voice calm and even a quiet counterpoint to her practiced cheer. "I would like to cancel my policy." I gave her the policy number from memory. I had written the checks for it for so long the digits were etched into my mind like a prayer. "Certainly, Mrs. Reed," she said. The sound of her typing was a faint, rhythmic clicking in the background. "I can help with that. May I ask the reason for the cancellation?" It was a standard question, but for a second, the truth hung in the air between us, vast and unspoken. Because my kindness was mistaken for a utility. Because my son would stand by and watch me die. But power was not in the outburst. It was in the understatement. The quiet click of a lock turning. "I no longer require the service," I said simply. "Okay, I see," she replied, a slight hesitation in her voice. "Now this is a family plan, Mrs. Reed. Canceling the policy will terminate coverage for all listed dependents, Michael Reed, Tanya Reed, and Caleb Reed. Is that correct?" She read their names aloud, and each one fell into the silence of the room like a stone into a still pond. There was no pain, only finality. "Yes," I said. "That is correct." There was another pause. Perhaps a hint of surprise in her silence before her professionalism clicked back into place. "All right, Mrs. Reed. The cancellation will be effective at midnight tonight. A confirmation letter will be mailed to your address on file. Is there anything else I can help you with?" "No, Jessica," I said. "That will be all. Thank you." I placed the receiver back in its cradle. The click was the only sound in the room. I had done it. I had removed the shield. There was no elation, no triumphant surge of adrenaline. There was only a quiet, profound sense of peace. The ledger was balanced. The account was closed. I had stopped paying for a family that no longer existed. The month following the phone call was one of the strangest of my life. On the surface, nothing changed. I continued to cook their meals, the familiar scent of garlic and herbs filling a kitchen that no longer felt like a part of me. I continued to clean their house polishing surfaces that reflected a woman I didn't recognize. I continued to pick Caleb up from school, listening to him chatter on about kickball and spelling tests his small hand held loosely in mine. I moved through their home like a ghost, my actions automated my heart, shielded behind a wall of quiet observation. But inside, I was different. I was no longer a participant in their lives. I was an observer, a chronicler of their obliviousness, and they noticed nothing at all. They treated me with the same benign neglect, as always their conversations flowing over and around me as if I were a piece of furniture, a rock in the stream of their existence. Tanya complained about a colleague at work who stole her ideas. Michael fretted about a project deadline, pacing the living room with his phone pressed to his ear. They planned a weekend trip to a ski resort in Vermont, debating chalets and lift ticket prices for 2 entire evenings, never once thinking to invite me, never once considering who would look after the house. They were so wrapped up in the intricate architecture of their own lives that they never thought to check the foundation. They mistook my renewed silence for submission, a return to my proper place after my brief, inconvenient illness. It was easier for them that way. They didn't see the cool, watchful clarity that had settled in my eyes. They didn't notice that I no longer hummed while I kneaded the dough for their morning bread my hands working the dough with a mechanical, joyless efficiency. They didn't notice that the stories I once told Caleb before bed tales of clever foxes and foolish kings had simply ceased. My silence was not empty. It was full. It was the heavy, charged air before a thunderstorm. I watched them go about their days with a sense of clinical detachment. I saw the way Michael would wince as he stretched for the remote, rubbing a persistent ache in his shoulder that he dismissed as sleeping wrong. I heard Tanya on the phone with her dentist's office, her voice tight with annoyance as she scheduled an emergency checkup for a nagging toothache she couldn't ignore any longer. I saw Caleb practicing basketball in the driveway, his movements becoming more reckless, more careless, full of a youthful immortality that made my own breath catch in my throat. They were all walking on a high wire suspended over a great chasm, completely unaware that the safety net had been carefully, deliberately removed. There was a quiet power in this knowledge. I was the sole keeper of a truth that would soon upend their entire world. Every meal I served them felt like a final act of a play only I had read. Every dish I washed in the sink was a small, silent farewell. They were living on borrowed time, protected only by the 30-day grace period before the cancellation letter arrived. I found the letter in the mailbox one Tuesday afternoon, tucked between a glossy furniture catalog and a utility bill. It was in a crisp white envelope addressed to me in simple typed letters. My heart gave a single steady beat. I slipped it into my apron pocket before they could see it and took it to the quiet of my small room. It was a single page, a formal impersonal confirmation of the termination of policy Draj 74B 921, effective in 7 days. I read it once, then folded it neatly along its original creases and placed it in the manila folder with my other important papers. It was my receipt, the proof that the transaction was complete. That night at dinner, Michael mentioned his blood pressure was high at a pharmacy kiosk. 150/100, he mused, reaching for another helping of the mashed potatoes I had made. I should probably get it checked out properly. Tanya, scrolling through photos of ski lodges on her phone, nodded without looking up. Maybe after we get back from the slopes, honey. I said nothing. I just continued eating my portion. The calm recitation of facts in my head, a quiet, steady drumbeat against the sound of their chewing. The storm was coming, and they were walking right into it, completely, blissfully unaware. The reckoning began, as it so often does not, with a roar, but with the careless joy of a child. It was a crisp Saturday, a little over a month after my quiet phone call. Caleb was playing in a basketball tournament, his young body a blur of motion and boundless energy. Michael and Tanya were in the stands, performing the role of proud parents, their cheers echoing in the gymnasium. I was at home, sitting in my worn armchair, mending a tear in Caleb's jeans. The needle moved in a steady, rhythmic pattern, a quiet counterpoint to the storm that was about to break. My phone rang, slicing through the afternoon silence. It was Michael. His voice, usually so confident and dismissive, was tight with a panicky edge I had not heard in years. "Mom, it's Caleb. He fell. His arm. It looks bad. We're on our way to the emergency room at St. Joseph's." A genuine pang of concern for my grandson went through me, an ache for his pain that was instinctual maternal. But it was immediately followed by a wave of cold, calm certainty. The first tremor was beginning. The foundation was about to show its first crack. I'll be right here if you need anything. I said, my voice as smooth and steady as a frozen lake. An hour later, Tanya called. Her voice was a frantic, high-pitched whisper, the sound of a carefully constructed world beginning to fray at the edges. Evelyn, there's a problem. A huge problem. She was speaking quickly, her words tumbling over one another. They're saying our insurance isn't active. They're telling me Caleb isn't covered. The performance had begun. I could picture her perfectly standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital reception, her face a mask of furious disbelief. She would be arguing with the registration clerk, her voice rising. "That's impossible," she would be insisting. "There must be a mistake. You need to run it again." "I'm sure it's just a system error, Tanya," I said into the phone, my voice a placid pool of calm in her storm of panic. "These things happen." "A system error," she shrieked. "They're asking for a $5,000 deposit before they'll even do an X-ray. $5,000. This is a nightmare. Michael is trying to sort it out." But there was nothing to sort out. The truth, unlike their lives, was absolute. In the background, I could hear Michael's frustrated, angry voice arguing with someone, likely a poor soul, on the insurance provider's after-hours line. He would find no help there. The policy he was referencing, the one he had taken for granted his entire adult life, no longer existed. They were forced to pay. I could almost feel the vibration as Tanya swiped her credit card, her hand trembling slightly as she signed the slip. The first crack in their impenetrable armor had appeared, and it was a costly one. That evening they returned home, their faces grim and shadowed with a new kind of worry. Caleb's arm was snug in a bright blue, cast a trophy from his misadventure. But his parents' moods were darker than any winter storm cloud. "It's a clean break," Michael said, his voice clipped and cold. He wouldn't look at me. He busied himself with getting Caleb a glass of water, his movements stiff and unnatural. Tanya, however, stared directly at me. Her eyes, usually filled with disdain, were now narrowed with a sharp, pointed suspicion. "There was a situation with the insurance," she said, her voice dripping with accusation. "They said the policy was terminated last month." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like poison. "Did you forget to pay the bill, Evelyn?" The question was an insult, wrapped in a thin, pathetic veil of concern. In their immediate panic, their minds had jumped to the most convenient conclusion: my incompetence, my senility. The old woman had forgotten. I met her hostile gaze without flinching. "I don't handle your bills, Tanya," I said softly, my voice betraying no emotion. "I haven't seen an insurance statement in years." It was the honest truth. The paper statements had stopped coming the month after the policy was canceled. My name was clear. Her accusation hung in the air between us, heavy and ugly, but it couldn't stick. She had no proof, only a gnawing, dreadful feeling that something was deeply wrong. They retreated into their bedroom, and I could hear their muffled, angry voices through the closed door. Their foundation had trembled, and they had absolutely no idea who was responsible for the quake. They were looking for a broken pipe, never imagining someone had turned off the water at the main. Caleb's broken arm was not an isolated event. It was the first domino in a long, cascading line. In the weeks that followed, it was as if a protective spell I had unknowingly cast over their house had been lifted. The mundane misfortunes of life, The aches and ailments that I had silently shielded them from began to arrive with relentless precision. The universe, it seemed, was intent on teaching them a lesson in vulnerability, one exorbitant bill at a time. The next to fall was Tanya herself. The nagging toothache she'd been casually complaining about for weeks suddenly blossomed into a throbbing, agonizing pain that left her pale and unable to sleep. A panicked late-night visit to an emergency dental clinic brought a grim diagnosis: an abscessed root that was dangerously close to spreading. The dentist, a no-nonsense man with tired eyes, was blunt. "You need a root canal immediately," he stated, sliding a treatment plan across the desk. The cost was astronomical, a four-figure number that made Tanya audibly gasp. As she fumbled in her purse for her wallet, the receptionist delivered the next blow with practiced, almost bored efficiency. "We'll need payment up front for the procedure," she said, not unkindly. "We tried to run your insurance, but the policy is showing as inactive." Those two words, inactive policy, had become a curse upon their house, a specter that haunted every phone call and every piece of mail. They had spent days on the phone with the insurance company, their frustration mounting with each transfer and each minute spent on hold. They were always met with the same polite, impenetrable bureaucratic wall. The script was always the same. "I'm sorry, sir, but the policy was canceled by the primary holder, Mrs. Evelyn Reed, on the 15th of last month." They never mentioned these calls to me. Their pride, a fragile thing I now saw, or perhaps their fear of what they might learn, kept them from confronting me directly. They were still operating under the comforting illusion that this was all a catastrophic mistake, a bureaucratic tangle that with enough angry phone calls could be fixed. But now faced with another massive, unexpected bill, their carefully constructed facade of control began to crumble. The arguments started. I would hear them from my room, their voices no longer confident and dismissive, but strained with a fear that was turning into blame. "We can't afford this. Michael—" Tanya's voice was sharp-edged with panic. "Caleb's arm, now my tooth. What are we going to do? This is thousands of dollars." "I don't know." Michael's voice was tight, with a stress I could almost feel pressing down on the house. "I'll look into getting a new policy tomorrow. We have to do something." But they quickly discovered that obtaining new health insurance isn't like buying a loaf of bread. There were waiting periods, applications, questions about pre-existing conditions, and Michael's high blood pressure, the one he had so casually mentioned weeks ago, was now a significant red flag. A follow-up visit with a doctor, paid for out of pocket, confirmed his condition was serious. It required ongoing medication and a battery of expensive tests they could no longer afford to schedule. Their world was shrinking, the walls closing in. The planned ski trip was quietly canceled. Dinners out were replaced with tense, silent meals at the kitchen table, the food I cooked for them tasting of anxiety. Tanya returned a designer handbag she had bought, the small pleasure turning to ash in her mouth. The sense of effortless suburban affluence they had cultivated for so long was draining away like water from a cracked basin, revealing the desperate, anxious reality that lay beneath. They were adrift in a sea of medical bills, and every new wave threatened to pull them under. I watched it all, a silent observer, in the eye of a storm I had created. I felt no joy in their suffering, no petty thrill of revenge. I felt only the cold, hard satisfaction of a truth being revealed. They were learning slowly and painfully that the security they had believed was their right had never been their own. It had been a gift, and a gift once taken for granted can always be taken back. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. The mail had arrived, and with it the first bill from the hospital for Caleb's emergency room visit and orthopedic surgery. It was a stark white envelope that felt heavier than it looked weighted with a future I would no longer be funding. I had placed the stack of mail on the polished granite of the kitchen counter, as I always did, and retreated to the quiet sanctuary of my room. This house I had paid for, held its breath around me. A few minutes later, I heard it the sound that signaled the beginning of the end. A sharp, tearing intake of breath from Tanya, followed by a choked, guttural sound of disbelief. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any shout could ever be. It was a vacuum, pulling all the air and peace from the home. Then I heard the footsteps. They were not the usual hurried clicks of Tanya's heels or the lazy shuffle of Michael's slippers. These were heavy, angry thuds coming down the hall, each one a hammer blow against the floorboards. I had refinished myself. My door was thrown open without the courtesy of a knock. Michael stood there framed in the doorway, his face a ghastly shade of pale. A single muscle twitched in his jaw, a frantic, pulsing rhythm of restrained fury. In his hand, he held the bill, clutching it like a weapon. Tanya was right behind him, a shadow of rage, her eyes burning with a furious, desperate light that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. This was it. The moment of reckoning I had been waiting for. "What did you do?" Tanya's voice was a low hiss, venomous and shaking, with a rage that was almost palpable. She took a step forward, invading my space. "This bill, it's for $17,000. $17,000. And it's just the first one. What did you do, Evelyn? The use of my first name was meant to be a final cutting act of disrespect. It no longer had any power over me." Michael finally looked at me, his expression a tangled mess of fear and raw betrayal. "The insurance company said you canceled it," he said, his voice cracking. "You. Why, Mom? After everything, after all we've been through, why would you do this to us, to your own grandson?" They stood before me like prosecutors in a courtroom of their own making, presenting their evidence of my betrayal. In their minds, the verdict was already decided. They saw only their own sudden, shocking pain, their own immediate fear. They had already forgotten the sight of me just months ago, sick and struggling for breath, being met with their cold impatience as they waited for me to sign yet another check. They had forgotten the 2 decades of my service, my silent financial support that had built the very foundation of their comfortable lives. All they could see was the consequence. All they could feel was the bill. I did not grant them the satisfaction of a reaction. I did not rise to their level of hysteria. I remained seated on the edge of my bed, a perfect picture of maternal calm. My heart was a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. It was not the frantic beat of fear, but the measured cadence of resolution. I had prepared for this moment. I had rehearsed it in the quiet hours of the night, envisioning their outrage, their disbelief. I met their furious gazes with a quiet, unwavering calm that seemed to unnerve them more than any shouting match could have. From my bedside table where it had been waiting, I picked up the folded letter from the insurance company. It was the confirmation of cancellation, crisp and official. It was my only piece of evidence, the only statement I needed to make. I held it out to Michael. He took it with a hand that trembled visibly. He unfolded the single sheet of paper, his eyes scanning the paragraph that sealed their fate. I knew the words by heart. Policy terminated by primary holder, Evelyn Reed, effective on the 1st of the month. He looked from the damning paper to my face, and I watched his own crumble. The narrative they had constructed in their minds of an incompetent, forgetful old woman's costly mistake had just been obliterated by a single typed sentence. This was no accident. This was no lapse of memory. This was an act. A deliberate, calculated, and final act of self-preservation. "Why?" he whispered again. But the anger had been hollowed out of him, replaced by a vast, empty bewilderment. His world had been tilted on its axis, and he was staring at the woman who had done it. He was finally seeing me. The air in the room was thick with the weight of their shattered reality. It clung to the furniture and muted the sound of the city outside a heavy blanket of consequence. Tanya stared at me, her mouth slightly agape, the casual fury in her eyes now replaced by a look of utter, childlike disbelief. The weak, forgetful old woman, she had so easily dismissed the one who couldn't be trusted with a simple grocery list, had just dismantled their carefully constructed lives with a single phone call. The call to the insurance company informing them that the policyholder, me, was canceling the premium protection plan I had paid for out of my small pension for the last decade. The plan that protected Michael's business from exactly this kind of disaster. I finally stood up from the edge of the bed, my movements slow, deliberate, each one a measured beat in the final rhythm of our life together. My joints ached, but I refused to let it show. I looked at my son, at the man he had become a stranger, wearing my child's face. His expression was a storm of confusion and dawning horror. "You ask me why, Michael?" I began, my voice quiet, but carrying the force of a final judgment across the silent room. It was not the voice of anger which they were used to weathering, but of profound, sorrowful clarity. It was the voice of a truth they could no longer ignore. "Let me ask you something first. A month ago, I lay in this very bed, unable to catch my breath. The chill in my bones was so deep I thought it might crack them. I was sick, and I was scared. I called out to you. I asked for help. A ride to the doctor, a bowl of soup, anything." I paused, letting the memory so vivid to me settle in the thick air between us. "Your wife," I said, my gaze shifting to Tanya, who flinched as if I had slapped her, "told me it was just old age catching up to me and that I was being dramatic." The color drained from Michael's face, a slow, sickening tide of gray. "And you didn't even look up from your phone. You just nodded." The memory, so easily discarded by them like a used tissue, had been preserved perfectly by me. It was a relic of their indifference, a monument to my invisibility. "In that moment," I continued, my voice steady, "I understood everything with a clarity that only pain can bring. I was not your mother. I was a convenience. I was the live-in cook who made the meals you liked. I was the cleaner who kept the house just so. I was the unpaid babysitter who was always available. I was useful. But my health, my fear, my life, That was an inconvenience you were both too busy to deal with. I walked over to my small closet, the one tucked away in the corner, as an afterthought, and opened the door. Inside, sitting neatly on the floor, was a single packed suitcase. It had been there for weeks. I had been ready. For 10 years, I held a shield over this family. A shield you never even knew existed. Every month, I took money from the pension your father left me, and I paid for the policy that protected you from this very outcome. I did it silently, without thanks, because I thought my love was enough to fill the silence. But I was wrong. I turned to face them fully. Two statues of shock. Love without respect is not love at all. It's a service. And my services are no longer available. I looked at them one last time, their faces a canvas of dawning regret. But I saw no remorse in their eyes for their cruelty. Only panic. It was the regret of a gambler who had made a fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated their opponent. They had underestimated me when I needed help. I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, the final sharp point of my message: you left me to face my sickness alone. Now you will learn what it feels like to face yours without a shield to protect you. It is not revenge, Michael. It is not punishment. I met his wide, uncomprehending eyes. It is reality. A reality you chose with every day you looked through me. With every moment you made me feel like a ghost in my own home. I picked up my suitcase. It felt impossibly light in my hand, as if it held not my meager belongings, but my freedom. I walked past them, out of the room they had made my prison, and down the hallway where my footsteps had always been silent. I did not look back. I opened the front door. The cool night air rushed in a clean breath, washing away the stale atmosphere of the house. I stepped out onto the porch, into the quiet dark, and I closed the door gently behind me. I didn't slam it. A slam would have been an outburst of passion. My final message was my silence. I now live in a one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a quiet building overlooking a small park. The morning sun streams through the window, a warm liquid gold that pools on the polished wooden floor. The only sound is the gentle chirping of sparrows in the oak tree outside and the distant, reassuring hum of the city waking up. It is not grand. It is not the sprawling 5-bedroom house I left behind, a house filled with echoes and expectations. But every corner of this small space is mine. Every single inch. The teacup I drink my morning jasmine from is not a relic from a forgotten wedding set. It is a simple ceramic cup, a pale celadon green I chose myself. It is not chipped. The armchair I sit in, angled perfectly to catch the sun, was not a hand-me-down from a relative. I tested 10 different chairs before I found this one, the one whose arms felt like a welcome embrace. The air I breathe is clean, free of the suffocating silent weight of being unseen, of being a ghost in the architecture of my own family's life. I found peace not in their downfall, but in my own quiet, deliberate liberation. I hear things sometimes. An old neighbor, Carol, who was always kind, still calls to check on me. Her voice is always hesitant when she brings them up, as if she is handling fragile, broken glass. I hear that Michael and his wife Tanya had to take out a second mortgage on the house. Their daughter's recurring ear infections, Michael's emergency appendectomy, small crises that once would have been absorbed by my savings account, have apparently bloomed into a mountain of medical debt. Carol tells me they are selling the house now, the one they were so proud of, the one with the pristine lawn I used to weed on my hands and knees. The life they built on a foundation of my silent sacrifice has crumbled. I do not feel a spark of joy at this news. There is no triumphant surge, no desire to say I told you so. Instead, I feel a quiet, somber vindication. It is the feeling of watching a long, complicated story reach its natural, inevitable conclusion. The final chapter writes itself. I did not engineer their ruin. I did not cast a curse or wish them ill. I did not destroy their lives. I simply stopped paying to maintain their fiction. I was the silent investor, the invisible grant that kept their glittering lives afloat. When I withdrew my support, my time, my energy, my money, my spirit, the entire enterprise was revealed for what it was, a beautiful facade, with nothing holding it up from within. This story is not just mine. It belongs to every mother, every woman who has poured her life into the vessel of her family only to be treated like a piece of furniture when she is no longer considered useful. To the women who might hear this someday, who have been made to feel like a burden in the very homes they helped build, who have been told their concerns are dramatic and their needs are inconvenient. Hear this. Your worth is not a premium to be paid for someone else's comfort. It is the policy itself. Your kindness is not a contract for endless, unappreciated service. It is a gift, and gifts can be revoked when they are taken for granted. Do not let them mistake your silence for surrender or your patience for permission. Sometimes the most powerful act of love is not holding on tighter, but letting go. Letting them feel the full, unbuffered weight of a world you once made lighter for them, a world you made easier without them ever knowing the cost. Keep your name on your dignity. Keep your name on your peace. You are the policyholder of your own life. Never, ever sign that power away. And so another story comes to a close, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful statements are made not with a shout, but with a whisper. Justice can take many forms, and quiet resolution is its own profound victory. Thank you for watching Her Quiet Revenge True Stories. What are your thoughts on how this situation was handled? We invite you to share your perspective in the comments section below. Your insights and stories enrich our community. Don't forget to subscribe to Her Quiet Revenge True Stories and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next compelling account. We look forward to seeing you again.